Hi, welcome back to part 2 of episode 3 of The Code on Knowing Humans Better. I'm back with Anne and Samia and we're continuing to talk about how we know humans better. So, Anne, what is your predictions for how consumer behaviour will change in the next 10 years?
Oh gosh, I mean, that it will change dramatically, as we said before, at pace. I think if I look back over the last 10 years, there are jobs and roles being created that we'd never even envisaged. Who knew social media was going to be a thing, right? The power of data. When I started in the workplace, I had a lot of friends who went into marketing and advertising and events, really cool parts of marketing. And I went into data, it's like the engine room of marketing. Who knew data would be cool? But I do think using data responsibly and in a sustainable way to really deliver meaningful connections to consumers will be key. That expectation economy, the power is really with the individual. And if brands don't get it right, there's no second chances. You have one opportunity to make a great impression with a brand. And I think brands are becoming about more than just, for example, a transactional purchase. We talked about people choosing their mission. I listened to a podcast this week with a retailer that I love, and it was all about travel and lifestyle. And, it wasn't about the brand or the product per se, because it's about how it makes you feel. So I think the power is really going to be with the individual. And I think brands are going to have to invest in data, tools, technologies, and working practices that really enable them to stay ahead of the pace of change.
Yeah, like for me, information is like at the ready on our fingertips. People being exposed to so many things at once across different platforms. And with that comes with more knowledge. So consumers are being more picky with the brands that they engage with. And like I've seen personally, people becoming more aware of their favorite brands, like maybe being involved in some controversial like causes, issues behind the scenes, and you've had people switch away from those brands just simply because they found out that new information. So with brands, they need to think about what information is out there about their brand and what can they do to change it to attract more consumers. And yeah, for example, we've seen lots of fast fashion brands change their image online, saying, oh, we're more sustainable or more ethical. And they're doing that because of the backlash they face from consumers online who done numerous TikToks, lots of Twitter spaces, lots of Instagram lives, basically calling them out. And the brands, I think they're starting to get aware that, oh, wow, people are actually thinking about these things. So I think we're definitely going to see that more in the next few years, where people are going to research who they buy from, who they engage with. Me personally, I do that. Whenever I engage with a brand, I want to make sure that it's an ethical choice, because I don't want to use my money for something that funds unethical actions. So yeah, that's a trend definitely in the younger generation, because we want a world where things are more ethical, more sustainable, more fair for every community, and brands just need to get aligned with that.
I think you're right, it's not about tokenism, it has to be embedded in their supply chain and in the ethics of the brand.
And trust me, like people will do their research. Like Google is like a great resource when you find a brand and it's like, oh, like how much do they pay their workers? And I'm not sure if everyone saw on International Women's Day, there was a gender pay gap bot that surfaced up on Twitter, and every time a brand posted, oh, happy International Women's Day, the pay bot actually said, oh, this brand's average salary for women is actually lower than men. Yeah. And they did that for every company that tagged their post of International Women's Day. And it was actually a great awareness campaign, because lots of people say, oh, actually, I didn't know that. I'm going to stop consuming from that brand. So brands need to be aware that these trends are happening and people do care, because people want to look good and also they want to feel ethical about the choices they make in life. And that's definitely something that's going to grow inevitably in the next few years.
Yeah, I agree. And I think social media is a massive driver for social change. And I think social media itself almost becomes embedded as a value within people, because people rely so much on social media, especially brands. And I think when a brand is trying to actually promote their values, that's one of the ways they can really communicate and actually connect with their clients and their consumers. And I think you were absolutely spot on when you said about how social media and how much that is driving all this change. I think it's just so important that it's made aware of exactly how much that is impacting, because not only does social media obviously have a positive impact, but in other turns it can have a negative impact as well. Have you found that any things that you've been looking at especially have had a negative impact in terms of the petitions that you maybe have been looking at and all things like that? How have social media impacted that in a way maybe counter to what it was hoping for?
So I wouldn't say it's negative. I think it's an involvement of issues that we see today. So for example, if a petition comes out, or I make a post on a certain issue, people might come back and say, oh, hey, but you didn't think about this aspect of the issue. I wouldn't perceive it as negative. I'll just perceive it as a learning lesson. And that's what people need to come to terms with. Social media is a great opportunity to develop your knowledge on different topics. And I understand social media can be very personal. It's on your personal phone, and when you're typing away, you feel like it's just you. But then when people are responding to you, might take it personal, but don't see it as that. Just see it as an opportunity for you to grow and be more in touch with reality. Because, for example, if I said, oh yeah, racism affects A, B, and C, someone might come and say, oh, but you actually missed out this community. And I'll be like, oh, thank you for telling me. There's opportunities for growth. I wouldn't see it as negative. So yeah, I haven't had experiences so far yet on social media, and I want to keep it that way. But obviously, if something does happen in the future, I won't see it as a personal attack. I'll just see it as an opportunity for growth.
Valuable feedback. Yeah. I think we're also going back to what you were asking about, how do we see the landscape changing? The role of digitalisation, I think, is going to be really interesting. I think if you think about, how people buy cars, gone are the days that you go into the showroom and, you engage with an individual and you may or may not purchase. Now, so much of that is moving online with the electrification of cars in the automotive industry. That's going to be huge. If you look at retail, what's the role of the high street store? It's going to be more about the experience and the brand engagement, and that's an opportunity to deliver those authentic brand messages that we talked about, rather than just a transactional purchase. What that does mean is when you come to do those transactional purchases online, it has to be a seamless execution, because right from the very first engagement with the brand through to after sale, people care about making relevant interactions. So I think there's just going to be so much that brands are going to have to contend with. But that feedback, to your point on, taking on board consumer feedback and learning from it is going to be key. And that ability to kind of, I hate the phrase, but to pivot to a new way of working or embracing a new data source or a new form of media or a new creative is just going to be so important. So I think adaptive brands are really going to be the ones that win with that total customer experience.
And I've seen lots of brands have negative experiences online when they don't take feedback well. Or so you have brands where there's a big, massive uproar on social media about their actions and the way they conduct their business. And you have brands that just go silent for months and then they come back, act as if nothing happened. And when you see that, from the consumer's perspective, it's they think this issue is just going to go away. They don't actually want to deal with it. They don't care about developing themselves. It gives a alert to us as consumers and be okay, this brand is not serious. It's not actually listening to us. So let's shy away from that. So with brands, it's important to take on feedback, and it's not going to be perfect every single step of the conversation, but you definitely need to acknowledge when your consumers are contacting you, communicating with you on your social media channels, because then they'll come back the next day and be X brand hasn't addressed this yet. We need to boycott them. So it's just, yeah, exactly. So that's just something they need to be mindful of.
Completely. I think that once again it comes back to the whole of this value concept that consumers want to engage more with the brand values. They're naturally going to fall, buying things from brands and interacting with brands that actually are in line with their values, because I think especially like Generation Z are so much more aware of social issues and all things like that, and maybe things that wouldn't have been brought up years ago are now coming to light. And I think consumers are so much more aware of the issues surrounding brands nowadays, as we've mentioned, like LGBT rights and animal welfare. It's so valuable for brands to actually engage with their consumers in that sense.
I also think as well, people are choosing their mission with who they want to work for. So for employers, there's a real responsibility to make sure you do embed that authenticity in what you stand for and being a force for good, because if you want to acquire, attract the very best talent in the industry and that diverse community that we talked about, it's about more than just a working transaction. It's about being part of a community that really matters. So I think as an employer, that's something we think about a lot is, what is it we stand for and how do we make this a really amazing place to work so that the humans that we attract to the business really feel like they belong.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as someone that's come in to work for Dentsu, that was something that I noticed from the minute that I set foot in the office or met everybody on Zoom, was actually how inclusive everybody is, and everyone sort of is made to feel that they're actually valued in the workplace. And I think that's something so important for a brand, and especially a company that, for me, coming to work for Dentsu, knowing that that's what I'm coming into, makes me so much more excited about coming to join than perhaps if I was going to work for another company that maybe weren't actually valuing their employees as much and taking on board what they're saying and what they have to say.
That's great to hear. I think you'll love it.
I can't wait. I can't wait.
Do.
But yeah, how about you? So with change.org, how do you find that you make it work for your employers and make them feel that they're sort of being listened to and learning more about them in the workplace? Because you said you're quite a small team.
Yeah, so working at change.org is honestly like one of the best roles I've ever had as a campaigns advisor, just simply because what attracted me to the role was their culture, rather than what I was going to do in the job. So obviously what I'm going to do in the job is important too, but the fact that they valued like a sense of belonging for each of the employees. So in the organization, we have lots of like community groups. So for example, if you're part of the Asia Pacific community, you've got your own group. If you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, you have your own group. And what they do really well is they set space in our weekly company calls where people can do a segment on their culture and identity. So last month, it was Black American History Month, and they did a whole segment on like the pride of being African American. And they also talked about like different cultures that people miss out from mainstream media. And then we've had months where it was like Pride Month, we had like our meetings conducted by drag queens. And one of my European directors dressed as a drag king, and she was like excellent at it. And whilst they did that, they talked about the history of drag, and they were talking about how people from that community were persecuted in the past. And so it's like when you're talking about like diversity, it's also good to address the history and the challenges that community faces, because through that you can still celebrate them rather than just tokenizing them for the products they bring into the world. And yeah, a sense of belonging is just something we do really well as a company. And honestly, I wish more companies did that, because when you feel a sense of belonging, you actually want to come to work. You actually perform better in the role that you do. And yeah, we just take identity very seriously, and we also take mental health seriously. So we have lots of partnerships with mental health companies who offer like free counseling for employees, who offer like free coaching. And it's important for people to feel safe in the workplace, because if you think about it, out of the 7 days of the week, you're spending a minimum of like 5 days in that week, out of that week at work. So it's important for your workplace to invest in those initiatives, because that's where you're spending most of your hours in the week. So it has a great, tremendous impact on your health. And it also like spills out into your personal life as well, because you know how these things affect your like sense of belonging in the real world, and then you pass that on to other friends. So I will tell my friends like, hey, can you suggest this to your workplace? I think it'll be really beneficial for you and everyone else. And that it has like a domino effect, because I've seen real examples happen in reality and I know it can work, so I pass those tips on to other people.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and I think the point you made as well about history, I think is so relevant and so important, because I'm a firm believer that history is there to be learnt from. Definitely. And in the fact that we've got all these things that might have happened, but actually we're learning from them now, and we're actually being able to take perhaps past mistakes into the workplace and turn them around. So now like the attitudes towards, you mentioned about the African community and LGBT community and mental health, and actually being able to implement the things that as a whole society we've learned from in the workplace, I think is so important.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense to separate your workplace from reality, especially when you're engaging with the real world on a day-to-day basis. I always found it confusing when companies would avoid like topics or like certain initiatives. It's like, you're working with real people who go out in the world, interact with different circles. Surely you need to address that in your own workplace. Not to like blur the lines between their personal and workplace life, but you're actually working real humans. You're not working robots. People have different identities. Like in the pandemic, we saw a rise of like people becoming new parents, for example. What does that mean for work culture? Should we embrace hybrid working more because people want to spend more time with their kids and build a family relationship? So what does that mean as a workplace? Should we give more flexibility in their work schedule? So it's like when you're real about what's happening out in the real world, you actually build a better world for your employees inside.
So is there a final thought that you'd like to leave our viewers with today? We'll start with you, Anne.
I think that, consumers want a very real relationship with brands. They're choosing their mission, and I think brands need to really put the customer at the heart of how they run and structure their business to deliver the meaningful interactions, and so they're going to have to change what they measure. They're going to have to do differently to respond to the expectations of today's consumer. So sit up and pay attention, because the power's with the individual.
Yes, pay attention and have more of a social media presence and invest in it properly, and pay your social media interns. Because people feel like social media is just light work, when it actually requires a lot of thinking, curating, and make sure you value that work, because that's the link between your brand and the consumers. And please be authentic and don't tokenize people.
Thanks very much for watching, and be sure to follow Dentsu on all the social medias to keep up to date with what we're up to.